there, St. Andrews. You know, with all the unrest in our country lately, I've been asking some questions, probably the same questions you're asking. How did we get here? How is it that people can be so filled with anger toward one another? How is it that we so often divide into one of two camps? I think the answer for this, at least part of the answer, comes from something I was reflecting on, the work of a Jewish existentialist philosopher who did his work after the Second World War. His name was Martin Buber, and I think part of what was going on in his mind had to do with some of these questions, like how can people commit horrible atrocities? How could there have been Nazi concentration camps where people did unspeakable things to other people, to other human beings? And of course, this behavior still goes on throughout the world today. One of his answers, and I'm probably oversimplifying it, has to do with what he defined as the I-thou versus the I-it relation. He said where we get into trouble is when we start treating other human beings as its rather than thous. When we have an I-thou relationship, you and I are in a relationship, we're talking to one another as human beings. We are entering into the humanness of the other by talking, conversing, forming community together. But what happens when that disappears is one person in the conversation becomes objectified, they become less human, and they become an it, an object. Right now I'm sitting on a chair. It's an object. And what happens when things go wrong is when we start treating other human beings, other classes of people, people of other races, of other socioeconomic statuses as its. When human beings treat other human beings as its, as objects, they begin to think that they can do whatever they want to them. And that's sadly, tragically, part of the story of how we get to where we are. I was thinking about 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul writes, if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away, see, everything becomes new. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. A little bit further down in verse 20, he says, so we are ambassadors for Christ, since God is making his appeal through us. We entreat you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. Now, this reconciliation that Paul is talking about is often talked about in churches as, well, it means getting into heaven. It's another way of talking about getting into heaven. But really, remember, there's really so much more to the story going on in the New Testament. The hopes of Israel, as Jesus comes to it, is very holistic. They want to enter back into the glory days of King David. They want to know that they are whole as a people, that there's abundance and that there's freedom and that God is king once again. So when Paul the Apostle, who is a Pharisee, is talking about being reconciled to God, he is talking about that in a very holistic way, that everything about life is the way it should be, and there is a social reconciliation with God's idea of what society should be like. There is a global reconciliation. There is even a cosmic reconciliation in some of Paul's theology, that we as human beings and we as a creation are restored in fullness to our original vocation, our original created vocation. It's a lot to think about, but just backing up the bus a little bit, just remember this week as you encounter other human beings and maybe you're impatient or maybe you see that click or that viewpoint on social media and you don't agree with it, be careful. Watch your heart that you're not objectifying other people and naming them or blaming them, but instead entering into relationships this week that are truly, authentically human.